Now I want to talk a little bit about a concept, model view controller. It's not super essential to understanding how everything works in web servers, but it's a great set of terminology that we use among web developers. And I think as you move into your role as a web developer, you ought to understand this. So this is a picture of the request response cycle. At the bottom we have the browser, and at the top we have a web server talking on port 80. The user clicks on a page, clicks on a link, the browser intercepts that link, opens a connection up to the web server, sends a GET request, the web server does its work, and returns a web page. And so that's sort of the basic request response cycle. And now we're going to, as in much of this class, really expand what we're going to do when we're in that web server. So that's where we're going to take a look at this. So basically, model view controller is really a set of terms that allow us to say this aspect, this part of the work that's going to be done in the web server, it's either the model, it's the view, or the controller. And so it's the most value that it has is to say, oh, that part right there, that's controller. So model view controller is independent of the programming language that you use, independent of the operating system that you use. It's pretty universal across as a concept, as an architecture, as a way of talking about web servers. So the three parts of it, it'd be probably better to call it controller view model or model controller view model or something like that. But model view controller rolls off our tongue better. So the definition in my mind of these terms is the controller is this sort of abstract idea of what happens next, what is the sequence of events that happen, and then where do we start from, what do we do when we get a request, and then afterwards, where do we go at the end of that. The view is all the stuff we see. It usually is at the end of the request response cycle, we produce a view and we return the view back. And one of the things that the request response cycle often does is either interacts by storing data in a database, like an insert, or it edits something and puts it in a database, or it just reads stuff from the database and shows it to us in the view. And so that's called the model. The database itself and sort of the notion that we have persistent storage inside the application, that's what we call the model. The view is what we see, and the controller is kind of the glue that puts it all together. So the controller orchestrates all this stuff. And so sometimes you don't say that's the controller, but the controller is like several places and the actual shape of your application. So when we receive a request, we have a number of tasks that we often have to do for each request. Sometimes if it's like a form that's been sent to us, we have some data that we have to receive, validate, and then process, and then store it in a database maybe. And so that's often thought of as the model work. Then once we've done that, we make a decision, like I stored this, where do we want to send the user? What do we want to show next? What page to show next? Maybe we show them, a thank you page, or maybe we send them back to the top page of the application. And so once we know what page we're going to send back to them, then that page has some data that we might have to pull from the database. And so we retrieve that using the model, and then we produce, perhaps using a template, some HTML response, and then put it back. So these are the four typical steps that we break down to say, in comes an HTTP request. First thing we do is if it has data that we're supposed to do something with, we handle it, maybe store that data in a database, then we talk to the database and retrieve more data to produce the next output that we're going to make, and then we produce the HTML or the other form of output and we send it back to the browser. And so if we take a look at this in our Django application, the Django application is pretty much a model view controller application in that the routing is very much the controller. It is that which it's like, here comes a URL, it's a request for something, where do we go? And so when you write urls.py, you're informing the controller. So the urls.py I would say is part of the controller action. The controller activity. The views is named the view. So the view is a little bit controller in that sometimes the view is storing some data in the database. Sometimes that's the job of the view. Here comes some data before the view produces the next output. It actually has to store what came in on this request. and then the view will do some controller activity, like it might decide, you know, I don't want you, this is the wrong page now that we've processed your data. I'm just going to send you over to some other page. That's kind of a controller activity. So it might say, I'll store the data. It might, let's see here, can I, yeah. So it might say, you know, here I go, I'm going to store some data, and then I'm actually just going to send you to a different place. I'm not even going to give you any HTML. And we'll talk about that redirect. That's called a redirect in a bit. Sometimes there is no data, and so sometimes you get some data, you route it to the right view, and maybe some data has to be retrieved from the database, merged together, and result is processed. So when we think of views.py, that is to me both the controller and the view production. So sometimes it's making decisions about where to go next. Sometimes it's just handling incoming data or sending data out. And similarly, the models is taken from model view controller, because the models.py is where we basically do all the work to talk to the database, whether it is storing stuff in the database or retrieving stuff in the database. We use the Django model capability to implement the concept in model view controller of models. So just a quick summary. I like to think of urls.py and some of the views.py as the controller. The models, of course, is all the things that talk to the database. And then the views are like the second half of views.py. So produce using templates and forms.py and et cetera, to produce the output and send it out. So now we're going to start producing the actual output of our application in the views and using templates. And there's a lot to cover here. So up till now, we've been starting to talk about URLs, which are simple. It says when you get the request with a URL of this format, choose a view and send it to that view. We're going to talk a lot about views.py and templates. In an upcoming lecture, we'll talk about forms. And we spent a bunch of time talking about models.py and how the models can talk to Python code, talk to the shell, how the models can inform how we write to the database and how we read from the database. So we're starting to fill parts in. As we put the views together, we're really starting to create our entire application. And I know it's taken a while to get to the point where we can update get to the point where we see the whole thing. So I just want to say that from time to time, wherever you have DJ for samples, whether it's on your laptop or whether it's on Python Anywhere, you should do a git pull from time to time, because I'm always working on these samples and I want you to make sure you have the latest copies of these samples. Sometimes I add little bits. I don't change the samples, but I add bits of documentation as I'm like, oh, I should have added that. So views are like the core of the application. I mean, the URLs find their way to views. Models tend to serve the needs of views, act as this layer to allow views to write and read the database. And so the views.py has a model aspect in that it handles incoming data. When we get to forms and post data, then we copy that into the database. The views.py decides sometimes whether or not to send the user to a different screen, or if it's going to produce the actual screen, the HTML, it produces that HTML, often using a template, and then sends it back. So the views are where the work really gets done. And what you see is you write a lot of code in the views. You write one line in the URL, a few lines in the models file, and then lots of stuff in the views. And I consider the templates kind of part of the views as well. So the first thing that Django does when it receives an incoming document, a request for a document, it basically parses that URL. And the first thing after the domain name is generally the application. So remember that Django has a project, and then underneath that there's one or more applications. In each of the DJ for each samples, you see lots of applications, each application kind of to show a little bit of sample code for a topic. And so that second part of the URL, that is the application name, and for all intents and purposes, it's also the folder name within the Django project. Now within that, usually the next chunk is the view. And so that view within application, the view within application is defined in urls.py. And then after that, there are two kinds of parameters. One is like a key value parameter that comes after a question mark. It also uses ampersands for that. And then sometimes we just put after slashes this This is more of a REST style URL that's very pretty, and you put the parameters right on the URL rather than the question mark, which is sort of the old school for doing all this stuff. So there is this thing in Django called the URL dispatcher. I sort of call it router on my picture. It's basically to get you to be able to define the URLs and how those URLs are to be parsed and handled, and how those URLs to be routed to the various bits of Vue code. And so we do this in urls.py. There are three basic patterns. First, you might route a particular URL pattern to a predefined class, and you'll see the example of that coming up. Or there's sort of functions, really old school function that take this request, which is an object that captures all of the data, the parameters, the URL, whether it was a secure request or not, what host it came from, what's the IP address it came from. All that stuff is wrapped up into this request object, which we'll talk about in a second. And that Vue function looks at that request object, decides what to do, talks to the database, maybe, and then sends back a response, whether it's a redirect or some HTML. And the function is kind of the low-level thing, but you can also then define a class. And defining classes, as we'll see, is really quite nice. The classes have methods like for get and for post, depending on the kind of incoming HTTP request that we're handling. And it also, in those methods, the request and any other URL parameters can also be sent in. So let's take a look at a sample urls.py from Vues. And we see examples of all three kinds of these routes. URL patterns is a global variable. It's just a list, but it has very special meaning. This list has very special meaning to Django. And you see these path commands, and there's other ways to describe these things. And then you have the path, and the blank path means sort of just slash right after the application name. And then we have which view to send it to. And so this template view as view, this is basically to save you from writing code if all you want to do is take a template out of the templates folder and return it. So you don't have to write your own code in views.py. And so it's already there, and that's why we go into Django Views generic import template view, and we're going to say, you know what, I'm going to route, I wrote that template, but I just don't want to write the code to go send that, just read that template and send it back. And so this is a predefined bit of Django that does this for us. Sort of the more old school thing is this syntax right here. And basically from .import views pulls in views/views.py. And then this, you will see our functions inside there. And then these are classes also from our views.py for this particular application. And the syntax is a little weird. This is the module we imported. This is the class from that. And then asView is a static method that returns a function that then can respond to the incoming requests. And we'll see. So now we're going to take a look at the code that actually writes the views, the code effectively in views.py. Now the first view that we're going to take a look at is one where we're not even writing any code at all. And this is that predefined view, that template view. And again, template view is code that a class that's given to us from Django, template view, and you pass it a parameter. So we're actually kind of calling a function here and passing a template name to it, and that is a file, views main.html. So this is the application views. There's a subfolder called templates, and then I'll talk about this in a bit. We repeat the application name twice, so that's a little bit weird, but it has to do with the fact that these names are global across all of the applications, and so you want there to be possibly more than one main.html, and so that's why you have this extra folder name, and you put this there, even though that feels a little bit redundant, but it's okay. And so this is just a static HTML file. I'm not going to read any data from a database. I'm not going to write any data to the database. I'm just going to read this file and send it back to the browser. And that's a common thing where we just have a file that we want to send back to the browser. And so we just don't even have to write any Python code other than add this entry into the URL patterns in urls.py. So that's a view where you wrote no Python code. Now, for the parts where you're going to write Python code for a view, you're going to be passed in variables. The variables are all about the request object. The request object is all the data coming in, and the response object is something you produce in the view and you send it all back. So the request object is an object instance of class HTTP request. This is a predefined Django, and there's just a whole bunch of things. The scheme. Now, what is the scheme? Whether or not it's secure or insecure HTTPS. The body, it's a string. So there's like about 20 or 30 attributes. We're going to use some of them, but you don't have to use all of them. But you can go look up the documentation, and the more sophisticated your application becomes, the more likely you're going to have to go digging in to find some little bit of the incoming request. You could think of this request data as all that data you see in your browser debugger about what data was sent to the server. That all ends up somewhere in this object. Now, when we return from a view, we have to send a response back. And so the response is something that we create inside of our view. It might be simply text that's HTML, or it might be a redirect object, redirect response that says, hey, go to a different page. And so we make that the main job at the end of the view is to produce a response and then return it back to Django. And so here is a very simple view. So here we're saying, we're in the views application. We're going to go to the view funky, right? And so in the URL's PY, we say map/funky to this function named funky. It's a funky function. That's why I call it funky. And so when it sees this, all the data coming into the request shows up in this variable that is the first parameter sent to that function. So that's what this is saying in urls.py. Take everything that goes to views/funky, gather up all the request data from the browser, put it in an object, and then pass that request object in. Now in this, I'm not really going to do anything with that request object because I'm always returning the exact same thing. And so I just have a nice triple quoted string of some HTML with less thans and greater thans, and I'm going to basically return. It is my job in the view to give back a response. There's a couple, two main types of them. One is an HTTP response, which is just like a body of text, and that's what I'm sending here. I'm sending an HTTP response. That's a constructor. We're constructing a HTTP response object and taking that string that I put in there, and away we go. Okay? And so that basically, if you hit this path, you're going to get this page back, and it sort of looks like that when it's all said and done. Okay, so now we want to talk about how we can get at parameters. So I mentioned that this request object that comes in to your view function has all the data from the request. Well, if we send to a view with this question mark, key value pairs, that's guess equals 42 on there, and we're going to route danger to views.danger and urls.py, and so all this data is wrapped up in this variable called request, passed into the function named danger. And so inside of request is some data. Request.get is a dictionary of the key value pairs that are on that URL. So to pull the 42 out, we can say request.get bracket quote guess quote, and that pulls that out. And so that's all we've got here is a really simple HTML page, and we are replacing that little chunk with 42. And so whatever this number is comes back out in the output. So your guess was 42. So that's how we pass get data into a view. So it's important from time to time to talk about ways that you as a web application developer have a responsibility to create secure web applications. And so I want to call your attention to places where you write code that seems like on the surface that it's what could go wrong, and then you realize, oh, wait a sec, that could go wrong. So it turns out that you take data from the user in the request object, whether it's from a form or from the URL, and like guess equals 42 seems innocuous enough. And then what I did is I just concatenated that into HTML and I sent that back. And so the problem is what if somebody with ill intent tries to produce data that actually does something? And the problem is if I take data straight from the user and put it back in the HTML response, well, HTML and JavaScript are programming language. Your browser is being programmed, and that means that a user typing data into your system can program the browser. And what's even worse is that, I mean, having them program their own browser, not such a big deal. But in a way, what they do is they put some data in your system that turns into code, and then they kidnap someone else's browser when they take a look at data that came in. This is called cross-site scripting, where in a sense what it's doing is it's trying to run code so that it can read stuff from your site and then hand it to a rogue site. And so we have to protect against this, and it's a very simple thing. So if we take a look at the code that was bad, basically we have this parameter guess, and in the last time I showed you that was 42. And we just took this request get guess, which is this stuff, and we simply concatenated it into some HTML. Well, if I carefully construct my guess with %C3, blah, 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 all the blah, 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 all that stuff, well, that turns into, this is a URL encoding of less than, B, bold, greater than, bold, slash, so that turns into HTML. So I passed into this application some HTML, and I as the developer took that and I concatenated it together, so the response source has HTML. It's HTML that mostly comes from the application, but this little bit of HTML came from the person who put it in. And like I said, it's not such a critical problem if I, in my browser, put stuff to take over your browser, but it is if someone, you can move that into someone else's browser. So what happens is that the browser sees this bold text in HTML, and instead of showing us the less than and the greater than, it actually shows it to us as bold. Now this seems innocuous enough until you do something much more clever, and that is, I am going to carefully construct some code, JavaScript. And so what happens is this here is encoding of that line right there, the script alert owned slash script. And so what happens is that came in and it was concatenated straight out. And if you run this page, you won't see the data, but actually JavaScript will run, and it's going to show up an alert box that says owned and OK. Now, you can go ahead and look at the Wikipedia entries on cross-site scripting. Generally, the idea is once you're in JavaScript, you don't just say alert that I've owned your browser. What you do is you do something like grab a cookie and send it to a third party, or you call, say, a web service on the system with a cookie and do bad things. Like you can convince a teacher to log in and change someone else's grade or delete all the grades in a class. Once you're into a person's browser in JavaScript, you can do a lot. So that's really quite scary, and there's all kinds of scenarios where you're taking data from the user, and you got to be careful because, yes, I said the guess is supposed to be a number, but if it's not a number, if I concatenate it without escaping it, it's a problem. So here is a safer version of that. So I've got another view function called game, and it takes that same request, and it still pulls that get data off, which is this bit right here, but then it calls a function, and that's Django utils HTML escape, right? So what that does is that concatenates that into the HTML, but escape processes any dangerous characters and turns them into what are called HTML entities. So less than becomes ampersand LT, greater than becomes ampersand GT. Right? These four things with ampersands are a safer version of it. And so that means that even though I put in the data for bold, it comes out with the less thans and greater than showing, and it's not actually interpreted, right? So this whole notion of escaping, or HTML entities, converting data, running the data from a user through an HTML entity's automatic filter, ensures that the user cannot provide you data that turns into code in their or someone else's browser eventually. So that's the kind of thing you have to think of as you're concatenating stuff together. And the key thing is the request get guess, that came from the user. And so we think the user's going to be nice, but a user with bad intent can send data that they carefully construct to cause them maximum trouble. But if you just escape your data before you concatenate it, there's nothing they can do about it. So another of the views is where we're going to parse the parameter off of the URL itself. These URLs are a little prettier sometimes than the question mark keyword equals value. And so, so let's take a look at this. The way you do this is in your URL patterns, you have a path, and instead of just having the path name, the view function name, you actually have this bracket, int colon bracket, guess bracket. And what that is, and you can go look this up in the Django documentation, there's a whole series of these things, that says the parameter after the word rest is an integer, and please pass it in as the parameter guess. So I've chosen the name to pass it in as a parameter, and then once Django sees this, it pulls that 41 off and hands it to us. So we don't have to tear the URL apart. Actually, in this request object, we do get the URL. We could do a bunch of splits and fool around, but nah, it doesn't matter. Let's let Django do all that work. Let's just tell it we want that parameter after the word rest. It's supposed to be an integer, and pass it to me in the variable guess. And then that same 41 comes in. I am cleverly escaping it before I concatenate it, and then I return a text-based HTML response with some HTML back to the browser. So this escape is there just because of cross-site scripting. I'm still taking this value, still coming from the user. So if any value comes from the user, you have to properly escape it before you show it to them. Now, those are all function-based, which are sort of a lower level. We haven't got to the point where we're talking about forms, but eventually in those lower level functions, you have to check whether you got a get request or a post request. Post request often comes from forms. And so this class-based view allows us to give a method for get and a method for post, and let Django pick whether it's a get or a post. And this is an object, and if you're a little rusty on objects, I've got a URL there on pythonforeverybody.com to review just like what a self is. I'm not going to cover all that. In the path command, you just have a string that comes after the application, routing to this. The main view, as view, is something you got to add to it because main view is a class, not a function, but as view is a function. And then we have to create a method get. Self, of course, is just part of Python's object-oriented work. Request is that first parameter, right? And so this one here is just a stock response, and just like the other ones, I return an HTTP response. Now it's like, why this looks a little more complex than the other one. Did the same thing, but it turns out there is tons of things that we can do. And inheritance, the fact it's a class, there are so many things about object-oriented programming that over the next few lectures we're going to really take advantage of this, and we ultimately will rarely write the old school function-based view. We'll do class-based views. And so we can also pass parameters to class-based views just like we can pass them to function-based views. You say, okay, with a prefix of remain, slug is a kind of string, and then guess is the parameter, so that says pull the string after the word remain off, right? Views is the name of the view, remain is the view within the application, and then this third parameter is the guess, and it's automatically parsed and handed to us in guess, and then we're going to respond to a get request. Self, of course, is the object-oriented thing. Here's the whole request, and guess is that little piece that comes off of the end of the URL. We're going to create a response by escaping the user provided guess bit, so that if the user puts something nasty in for cross-site scripting, haha, we stop them from doing that. And so that produces the same kind of output. Your guess was ABC 123 42 XY ZZY. So talking about return values, everything we've shown you up till now is your basic 200 OK, which means you asked for a page, I gave you a page. You're probably familiar with 404 not found, which means you ask for a page, that page doesn't exist. There is another kind of response that's not actually a page, which is a response header that says, you know what, it's not like you made a mistake, but you're at the wrong place. And we call it a redirect, and 302 means I know where you're supposed to be and it isn't here. And it was originally used for sites that would move. And it's all handled by the location header on the HTTP response. And so we send a redirect response, which is a 302 with the location header being set, and it uses our URL. And when the browser gets that the 302 and a location header, it doesn't show you what it just got, but it immediately re-gets that URL and then shows you that URL. And the original idea was that if you renamed a domain or something, you wanted to have the old domain redirect web browsers and search engines, you use these 302s. There's also a 301 header that can be used to redirect all this stuff. But now we use it for all kinds of things, and it's very much a controller function. If you go to Model View Controller, controller says, okay, we're done with that, but I want your browser to go over there. So that routing, that sort of routing the browser, changing the browser, putting the browser where you want it to be, that's part of the application's controller phase. So we can send a redirect from a Django view. And so here we go. If you go to this bounce, it's going to actually not end up at this, it's going to bounce it to somewhere else. And in the path, we just say if you go to the bounce view, run to this function. This is not a class-based function. This is an old school function. And so the request data is passed in. And instead of now returning an HTTP response, which we would put in here HTML, we are doing an HTTP response redirect, and now we put a URL. And what we're saying with this whole thing is, you're at the wrong place. Please, browser, when you get this response back, go here. So it's like it bounces to the browser and then bounces back and then reads that URL. So and you can have some output, but folks generally don't need output when you're doing a redirect. So if you take a look at that bounce, watching it in your network console in a JavaScript debugger, what you see is a set of 3 requests, actually just 2. You'll see the first request is going to bounce, and if we take a look at this request, we see that it's a 302. It's kind of small. You see we got a 302, which tells the browser something's wrong, I'm not at the right place. And then also the server sends the location header that says this is where you're supposed to be, and the browser immediately turns around and does a get to that URL, simple.htm, and then that's what we see. And then this 404, interestingly, the 3 statuses I talked to you about, is because at this new location, djfree.com/simple.htm, there's no favicon. Remember, the favicon is the thing that shows up like right there in the top tab bar is the favicon, and I don't have a favicon, at least not now for DJ Free. I should put a favicon there, but we get to see a 404, and all that means is the browser looked for a favicon and didn't find it. So we see a 302, which is moved with a location header, and then we see a get, which returns then a 200, which is a success, and we see the document, and then we see a 404 because it tries to grab the favicon. And so the HTML you get back from djfree.com simple.htm, that's this simple page with a simple link. Hello, now we're going to talk about the other half of the views, the templates. And the templates are our way of creating HTML. And again, just to ground everything that we've got here, we're in the views, and the views are really sort of the code, the Python code that we drive. We're going to get to forms in a bit, but views kind of merge stuff from the templates, merge stuff from the models, send stuff in and make pages, right? So this is going to look a lot like HTML. It doesn't have to be HTML. It can be things, but other than HTML. But templates in our class will mostly be HTML. And so they're kind of the last little piece of the puzzle to start building user interfaces. And from this point on, we're going to be making user interfaces rather than introducing the parts of a Django application that have the user interface. So this is the text from the Django website. It's about convenient ways to generate HTML dynamically, and there's a couple of different templating engines. We're using the default one, and there is some data that we pass into the template. There's a process that's called rendering, and then we get the HTML back, and we return to the browser with that HTTP response, which we've already been doing. It's not the request response cycle is the same. The difference is, instead of writing Python code to concatenate a bunch of things together, we are going to use a template engine. So this is the kind of stuff that we've been doing all along. We have a class in a view class, REST main view that extends this view. In comes perhaps the request object, and then maybe even another parameter. That's not changing. What we're doing here is we're using concatenation. Concatenation, these little plus signs, escaping, we're doing all the escaping and concatenating, and then we are sending back a response. So what goes back as a response, what comes in as a request, what goes back as a response. We're still going to do that. We're just going to get rid of that middle bit and make it a little prettier and make it a little more sense. If you look at that, if you look at it, you got to get it syntactically right. You got indentation problems. That's 3 lines of Python. I'm using triple quotes. I'm using plus. I got to get all that matching together. And then, eventually, I'm going to be in the HTML is going back. I'll be using single quotes and double quotes and all those kinds of things. And JavaScript's going to look really ugly here. Indenting of the HTML kind of will fight with the indenting of the Python. So this is just general. I mean, I've only done short ones because I only wanted to show you a little bit before we showed you templates. So the basic process is a bit of software, a template software that Django provides us. We're using the built-in Django one. And basically, template is some HTML with some hotspots in it that says, put data here. And then the rest of it is just HTML. And then we pass the data in some kind of an object, dictionary, etc. And then a bit of code pulls all that stuff together and then produces the HTML with all of the data placed in it. Often the render data that we're passing in is coming from a model, for example. We might talk to a database, load up a bunch of rows, and then put it in. But in the simplest form, what we've got is like a little dictionary. Call this the context. You could call it the render data, and then you have the render template. So the render template is really HTML, and that's what makes it a lot easier to look at because you're not putting double quotes around anything. There's no concatenation, but there are special characters. And what the double curly brace surrounding it says is, instead of that, take this bit out and replace it with whatever's in the variable dat from the render data. And so that's how, when it's all said and done, this is replaced in the fun stuff, replaces curly brace dat in the final output. And if you thought about it for a while, you could probably write a render engine. They're not that hard. Now you'll see they have some sophisticated features eventually, so you probably don't want to write your own render engine. But you could imagine a Python assignment where I say, write me a function that takes a dictionary that looks like that, and then with key value dat fun stuff, and then take some text file that has curly brace dat curly brace, and then find that and then replace it with that string. You could write that code. You don't want to write that code. Django has already written that code for you. So here's the code in action. And so this is we're going to call this. We're in the application named TMPL temple. And so we have the application temple, we have the view game, and then we have a number 200, and that's what we put in our urls.py to route the game view and take one parameter. Remember that slugs are a special version of strings that are letters, numbers, and dashes, I believe. And so the entire request coming in from the browser is coming into the variable request. This number 200 is coming in the variable from the URL is coming in the variable guess. And so instead of us concatenating together, we are going to create a context. What I call a context, which just is a dictionary of key value pairs. and the key for guess is GUESS. It's a string. That guess will matter inside the template. And then we pull this number 200 and we convert it to an integer, and then we pass it in. And this render, we pass it the request object, we pass it the name of a template, and then we pass the context, the key value pairs, to be substituted in that. So let's take a look. So if we look at this template, it has a series of curly brace, like hotspots, places where you would replace stuff. And so the double curly brace just says retrieve the string that is under guess and put it in. And so that's how we get your guess was 200 in the ultimate output. And then we have curly brace percent all the way to percent curly brace. And this is a series of if then else's. So you can put logic in here too. You don't have to just take this string and put it in. So what we're doing is we're basically saying if the guess is less than 42, we print out too low. If it's above 42, we print too high. And of course, if it is 42, we print out just right. And since our guess was 200, it prints out too high. And so basically, this makes this view code a lot simpler and doesn't put a less thans and greater thans and concatenations. It's all substituted by this render routine. Now, the render routine returns an HTTP response request. So when we get that back, we just return it. So we hand back to Django the HTTP response request, and then the page is displayed in our browser. Remember that we have a Django project, and this is the Django project. In my case, the Django project is DJ for eSamples, and I have a bunch of little applications. All these things, as a matter of fact, Temple is the one we're working at right now. Those are just the different pieces of sample source code that I built for this class to talk about. And so those are applications. So it's just that Django terminology. Project made up of one or more applications and folders. Okay? And so the problem is these templates, when Django starts up, based on the settings.py, it loads all these files up. Loads them all up. And so it loads them all up, and the templates are actually global, and we'll see this in a bit. They're global across all of the applications. And so the problem is that if you have a template name like detail.html and you have a whole bunch of applications like I do, all of which want to have a template named detail.html, it doesn't work, because which detail.html, it'd be template/detail in two folders. It's not clear which one you're talking about. So we've adopted a convention that we take the application name and we make a subfolder inside of templates. That's the application name. And then we use this favs/detail.html or pics/detail.html as the name of the template. So in a sense, we're introducing a subfolder. It's a little jarring at first because you see there it's the same. It's a good convention. I mean, it's unfortunate we have to have the convention, but because these names end up being global across your entire Django project, in each application, and to get them a name, to get them properly named, it's necessary to introduce this extra level of redirection. And when we get to logins, there's templates that are stored outside in other applications. So sometimes you want to get a template in some other application. So there's all kind of reasons. This is a great idea. It just isn't the prettiest thing in the world. So just when you see it, don't freak out. I try to call it out in the slides. And so we put these paths that includes the application name twice. It's weird, but it is necessary to do this because of the notion that all these template names are global across the entire application. But if then we call this the template name with the name of the application prefixed, away it goes. Django could have made that a little easier for us, but they basically didn't, and so we have to do that.